The summer of 1944 in Normandy had become a nightmare for the Allied forces. Weeks of intense fighting had ground the front to a frustrating stalemate. Every step forward came at an unbearable cost. The countryside, known for its lush hedgerows, had turned into a deadly maze. These thick, earthen walls, lined with trees and underbrush, offered the German defenders near-perfect cover. From the shadows, they could fire, retrieve, and reappear elsewhere almost at will. Every attack by the Allies felt like wading through a storm, with progress measured in meters rather than miles. The men on the ground knew the risks. Casualties were mounting, morale was fraying, and commanders were desperate for a solution. Among the German units were some of the most experienced and elite formations, battle-hardened soldiers who had survived campaigns across Europe. They understood the terrain better than anyone, and they used it to deadly effect, setting ambushes and creating crossfires that shredded advancing troops. Tank units found themselves bogged down, artillery struggled to be effective against hidden positions, and infantry was caught in endless firefights with no clear path forward. Communication lines between units were stretched thin, and even small mistakes could lead to catastrophic losses. The Allies tried everything: flanking maneuvers, heavy artillery barrages, and night assaults, but the Germans seemed always one step ahead. Each attack was met with resistance so fierce that entire companies were decimated before reaching their objectives. It was clear that a new approach was needed, something that could break through the stubborn defenses and finally open the way out of Normandy. Rumors began circulating among the men about a massive operation being planned, something unprecedented in scale. The promise of overwhelming force was on the horizon, but no one knew exactly how it would be executed. In the meantime, soldiers endured the harsh reality of the hedgerows: mud, blood, fear, and exhaustion. Nights were restless, filled with the distant echoes of artillery and the cries of the wounded. Survival often depended on intuition, quick thinking, and a measure of luck. The landscape itself seemed to conspire against them, hiding threats at every turn, turning even small advances into deadly encounters. The stalemate was more than just a military problem. It was a test of endurance, willpower, and ingenuity. Commanders on both sides watched and waited, calculating every move, knowing that the outcome of the next battle could tip the balance in this critical theater of war. Soldiers began noticing subtle signs of change. Reconnaissance planes spotted unusual movements, radio chatter hinted at a major operation, and whispers of a concentrated Allied attack spread among the ranks. Yet the hedgerows remained unforgiving, and no one could predict the scale of destruction that would soon arrive. Every man held his breath, aware that history was about to be written in the fields, ditches, and woods of Normandy, where courage, strategy, and sheer firepower would collide in a way no one could forget. And amid this tension, the men on the ground could only brace themselves for what was coming, sensing that a storm unlike any they had seen was about to strike the hedgerows of Normandy. After weeks of stalemate in the hedgerows, Allied commanders knew that the campaign in Normandy could not continue at its slow, grinding pace. The cost in lives was simply too high, and the front lines remained locked in a deadly deadlock. A bold solution was needed, something decisive that could shatter the German defenses and finally give the Allies the momentum they desperately sought. The planners turned their attention to the American First Army, led by Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who was charged with coordinating a breakthrough operation. The concept was audacious. Instead of slow, incremental attacks, the plan relied on the overwhelming use of firepower, combining massive aerial bombardment with precise artillery strikes, followed by rapid mechanized advances. Every detail had to be coordinated perfectly. Intelligence officers studied aerial photographs, analyzed troop movements, and mapped German defensive lines with painstaking accuracy. They identified sectors where the enemy was strongest, and more importantly, where they were vulnerable.
In preparation, the Americans amassed an unprecedented number of bombers and fighter bombers, assembling hundreds of aircraft to saturate the sky with explosives. Artillery units were positioned strategically to ensure that any surviving resistance could be immediately targeted. Meanwhile, infantry and armored divisions rehearsed their maneuvers, practicing speed, coordination, and the exploitation of any breach. Planners even accounted for terrain challenges. The hedgerows that had stalled advances before would be cleared and broken through by concentrated firepower, followed by tanks and troops moving swiftly to exploit the gaps. The operation was meticulously timed to achieve maximum impact, with synchronization down to the hour, ensuring that airstrikes would soften the defenses just before ground forces moved in. In secret briefings, commanders warned their soldiers that this would be unlike any assault they had ever experienced. The sheer scale of destruction was expected to be overwhelming, and the psychological impact on German forces could be just as significant as the physical devastation. Rumors and anticipation spread quietly among the troops, creating a mixture of anxiety and hope. Soldiers could sense that the stalemate might finally end, yet none fully grasped the magnitude of what was coming. Every logistic detail, from fuel supply to ammunition dumps, had been carefully arranged to support the operation. Even the weather was considered, with meteorologists providing crucial forecasts to ensure air and ground forces could operate effectively. Communications were tightened to prevent leaks, but even within the Allied ranks, the sense of history in the making was palpable. Officers spoke quietly of a hammer blow that could break the German lines, and soldiers held on to that vision with both fear and determination. The planning of Operation Cobra became a monumental exercise in military coordination, intelligence, and strategy. It demonstrated the Allies' ability to harness overwhelming force in a precise, controlled way. For the soldiers on the front, the promise of a decisive breakthrough offered a rare glimpse of hope, a chance to escape the endless grind of the hedgerows. And yet, beneath that hope was an unspoken fear. The destruction that would come would be unlike anything the battlefield had seen so far. The stage was set, the pieces in position, and the Allies were ready to unleash a storm that could change the course of the war in France forever. The morning of July 25, 1944, arrived with a tense stillness over the hedgerows of Normandy. Soldiers on both sides awoke to a sky that seemed ordinary, unaware that it would soon become the stage for one of the most devastating attacks of the war. At precisely the planned hour, hundreds of Allied bombers roared into the air, forming vast formations that darkened the morning sky. The strategy was simple but terrifying in scale. Obliterate the German defensive positions with concentrated aerial firepower before ground forces moved in. Explosions erupted across entire sectors, sending columns of smoke and dust into the sky, and shockwaves tore through hedgerows, trenches, and dugouts. German soldiers scrambled in confusion, communication lines shattered, and commanders struggled to coordinate a response. Units that had been well trained and experienced found themselves disoriented, cut off, and isolated. The impact was immediate and overwhelming. In many cases, entire platoons were destroyed before they could even react. Artillery that had once held German positions at bay now targeted the survivors, ensuring that the devastation continued even after the bombs fell. Reports from the front described the scene as surreal, the ground trembling with each explosion, trees uprooted, and defensive positions reduced to rubble. Soldiers who survived the initial strikes were forced to move through chaos, facing both the physical destruction and the psychological terror of the assault. The sheer power of the operation caused panic, and German reinforcements struggled to reach the front lines in time. Estimates suggest that more than 2,200 soldiers were killed or incapacitated in the initial phase alone, including elite formations that had previously been considered nearly invincible. The destruction was indiscriminate, hitting command posts, supply depots, and defensive strongpoints alike. German officers reported seeing entire regiments scattered or trapped in craters, unable to organize counterattacks. Radios went silent, and runners carrying messages risked their lives moving through the shattered battlefield. For those on the ground, fear and confusion became as deadly as the bombs themselves. Some units, cut off from leadership, surrendered immediately, while others attempted desperate counterattacks that were quickly crushed. Meanwhile, American soldiers watched from the edges of the destroyed sectors, realizing that the hedgerows that had once slowed their advance had been reduced to rubble, allowing tanks and infantry to push forward with unprecedented speed. The psychological impact on the German forces was devastating. Panic spread faster than the physical destruction, and the morale of elite units plummeted. Allied commanders observing the chaos below understood that the carefully coordinated plan was working perfectly. The massive aerial assault had not only killed thousands, but had shattered the organizational backbone of the German defenses. And even as the bombs fell and artillery fire continued, the first hints of a breakthrough began to appear. Roads that had been impossible to traverse were now open. Hedgerows that had seemed impenetrable were breached, and the way was prepared for the advancing Allied columns. It was a moment of transformation, when a single morning of overwhelming force turned weeks of stalemate into an opportunity for rapid, decisive movement. Soldiers on both sides would remember that day forever, a morning when strategy, technology, and sheer firepower combined to create a battlefield unlike any other, marking the beginning of the end for German resistance in Normandy.
By the afternoon of July 25, the full scale of Operation Cobra's devastation was becoming clear. The hedgerows that had for weeks slowed the Allies' advance were now reduced to shattered earth, twisted trees, and cratered fields. German defensive lines, once formidable and disciplined, were in chaos. The initial aerial bombardment had killed or incapacitated thousands, including highly trained and elite units that had been considered nearly invincible. Units were fragmented, officers dead or missing, and communication lines destroyed. Soldiers tried to regroup, but the combination of shock, confusion, and relentless Allied artillery made organized resistance almost impossible. The battlefield had become a scene of carnage, where every step forward revealed destruction and terror. Craters from bombs held the bodies of men who had fought courageously, while surviving troops stumbled through smoke, debris, and the wreckage of vehicles and artillery. Those who had survived the initial bombardment faced a grim choice: surrender, flee, or fight in impossible conditions. Even the most battle-hardened formations were unable to mount coordinated counterattacks. The scale of casualties was staggering. Historians estimate that over 2,200 German soldiers were killed or incapacitated in the first hours alone, and many more were forced into disorganized retreat. The impact on elite units such as the Waffen-SS and veteran infantry was particularly devastating. Their loss not only weakened German defenses physically, but also shattered morale across the front. Allied commanders moved quickly to exploit the opening. Tanks and mechanized infantry surged through the breached lines, meeting sporadic resistance, but encountering nothing like the coordinated defenses that had held for weeks. Every advance gained precious ground and widened the gap in German positions. Towns that had been heavily fortified were abandoned or fell after brief skirmishes. For the first time in weeks, the momentum was fully in the Allies' favor. The psychological effect on German soldiers was profound. Panic, fear, and confusion spread faster than reinforcements could arrive. Reports described entire battalions disintegrating under the pressure, soldiers surrendering in pockets, and officers struggling to rally men who were too stunned or too disoriented to respond. On the Allied side, there was a mixture of awe and urgency.
Soldiers advancing through the shattered landscape could see the results of meticulous planning executed flawlessly, yet they also witnessed the human cost of such a massive assault. Commanders pressed the advantage, pushing rapidly toward objectives, while the Germans attempted, and largely failed, to regroup. Supply depots, communication centers, and ammunition stores that had once supported the German front were destroyed or captured, further crippling their ability to recover. Entire villages that had been strong points were now empty, smoke rising from burned-out homes, and fields that had once been defended now served as routes for advancing Allied columns. The breakthrough that had seemed impossible weeks before was now a reality. Roads once blocked by hedgerows and mines were opened, supply lines could be established, and armored units moved freely into enemy territory. The morning's devastation had set the stage for a campaign that would sweep across Normandy, changing the dynamic of the front forever. The Allied success was not just tactical, but psychological, demonstrating that concentrated, coordinated force could break even the most stubborn defenses. By the end of the day, it was clear that Operation Cobra had achieved what many had thought impossible. It had shattered the German front, decimated elite units, and created an opening that would allow the Allies to finally break free from the deadly maze of the Normandy hedgerows.
By the end of July 25, 1944, the hedgerows of Normandy were no longer a barrier. They were a graveyard and a pathway. The destruction left by Operation Cobra had opened the door for Allied forces to move decisively beyond the front lines that had held them in check for weeks. Mechanized units, infantry, and tanks surged forward, exploiting gaps in the shattered German defenses. Roads that had once been clogged with mines, barricades, and troops were now cleared, allowing supplies, reinforcements, and armored columns to flow into newly captured areas. German resistance, once rigid and well-organized, was now sporadic and desperate. Retreating soldiers abandoned equipment, artillery, and vehicles, leaving behind a battlefield littered with the wreckage of war. The psychological impact on the German army was profound. The morale of even elite formations had been shattered, and many units no longer had the cohesion to regroup. The Allies recognized the importance of maintaining momentum. Rapid advances prevented German forces from establishing new defensive lines, and small towns, crossroads, and strategic positions fell quickly. Engineers and logistics teams worked tirelessly to repair roads and bridges, ensuring armored units could press deeper into enemy territory. The breakthrough did not merely advance the front, it transformed the campaign. Allied commanders capitalized on the chaos, encircling pockets of German resistance and capturing thousands of soldiers who could no longer fight effectively. The scale of casualties, both killed and captured, further weakened German capacity to resist subsequent advances. Local civilians, who had endured weeks of combat in their villages and fields, witnessed the dramatic change as Allied troops moved in, providing relief, supplies, and protection. Word of the success spread rapidly, boosting morale across the Allied armies and reinforcing the belief that the liberation of France was within reach. In the days that followed, the Allied advance accelerated at unprecedented speed. Key towns, roadways, and river crossings that had been critical to German defensive networks were captured, creating a domino effect that forced German units into a strategic retreat. The operation demonstrated the devastating effectiveness of combined arms strategy on a massive scale. Air power, artillery, and ground forces had worked in perfect coordination, reshaping the battlefield. The momentum gained allowed Allied units to link up with other advancing forces, culminating in the liberation of northern France. Soldiers who had endured the hedgerows now pressed forward with renewed confidence, knowing that their courage, planning, and sacrifices had paid off. Operation Cobra had not only destroyed German formations and opened the way for liberation, it had fundamentally changed the rhythm of the war.
By the time the dust settled, the Normandy campaign was transformed. The Allies had seized the initiative, German forces were in disarray, and the liberation of France was no longer a distant hope, it had become an unstoppable reality. The consequences of that single morning would resonate for the remainder of the war, shaping strategies, morale, and the course of history itself. Entire German divisions were now retreating in disorder, while Allied commanders pushed relentlessly forward, ensuring no opportunity for the enemy to regroup. The success of Operation Cobra became a symbol of precision, planning, and overwhelming force, demonstrating how a single coordinated strike could alter the trajectory of an entire campaign. From the shattered hedgerows to the open roads beyond Normandy, the stage was set for the Allies to march towards Paris and eventually to victory in Western Europe. July 25, 1944, would be remembered as the day when the tides of war shifted decisively in favor of the Allies, a day when strategy, courage, and relentless determination combined to erase weeks of stalemate in a single decisive morning.